Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents the complete and original Norwegian Folktales of Asbjørnsen and Moe by Peter Christen Asbjørnsen and Jørgen Moe, translated by Tina Nunnally. Foreword by Neil Gaiman. Narrated by Anne Richardson. Foreword by Neil Gaiman. I keep trying to write a measured and sensible introduction to this book, and I keep failing. I keep failing because in order to find out what I think, I pick up the proofs and start to read. Or rather, at this point, to reread and to reread any one of the Norwegian folktales waiting between these covers, and then I'm swallowed by them. I don't read them critically. I don't even put my compare this story from this tradition to this other story that it somehow resembles hat on. I just start to read, and I'm following the adventures of Ashlad, or the girl whose godmother was the Virgin Mary, and I feel satisfied. Someone is telling me a story. I first went to Norway in July 1998. I landed in a tired daze. I had flown to Oslo from Reykjavik, where the sun did not set, and my hotel had no curtains, so I had spent most of the past 3 days awake. I managed a day in Oslo of seeing people, of drinking my tea where Ibsen drank his coffee, and eventually I was taken to my room in the Grand Hotel, where the curtains, lined with black, closed, and in the glorious darkness I finally slept. I woke refreshed and had days of joy. I was introduced to the art of Theodor Kittelsen, 1857 to 1914, who drew trolls and the Norwegian countryside. Kittelsen was more than an illustrator or a folk artist, but he was not as well known as Arthur Rackham or John Bower. His trolls made sense. They were as much a part of the world as the trees and the hills. His drawings and paintings felt as though they had paused in their travels for Kittelsen to create their portraits. I learned that Kittelsen was once told that a rival had decided to start painting trolls, and he had been puzzled and upset by this. "How can he draw a troll?" he asked. "He's never seen a troll." The cover of this book features a painting by Theodor Kittelsen. I was driven across the country, from Oslo in the southeast to Bergen in the southwest, passing through the Hardanger Fjord region with its remarkable waterfalls, each a scenic joy. I found myself loving Norway. There was a wildness to the landscape that appealed to me, but it was a restrained wildness. I resolved to return. And return I do when I can. I love Norway. There is a gloom in Norway that creeps out in the oddest places. I delight in the Emanuel Vigeland Mausoleum in Oslo, a candle-lit chapel where people sit in silence and wait for their eyes to become accustomed to the darkness. Then they stare at the naked people and skeletons painted on the shadowy walls. Part of my delight is that the windowless red brick mausoleum is quietly just another building in a pretty tree-lined residential neighborhood. I encountered Asbjørnsen and Moe's Norwegian folktales sometime in the 1990s and really enjoyed them. They were story types I was familiar with, but there was a focus and a chill, a way of bringing characters on stage, and a canny use of what W.S. Gilbert called corroborative detail, intended to give artistic verisimilitude to an otherwise bald and unconvincing narrative. That engaged me. Still, the translation I read then was a century old, and it creaked at the edges, sometimes. I was already in love with Norse mythology, and one can feel the shadows of the frost giants in some of these stories, or echoes of the tale of Thor and the Loki and the Thialfi of the contest with the giants. Asbjørnsen and Moe also sensed this and drew attention to it. Our sacred mysteries become myths, become folk tales, and frost giants and gods become trolls and heroes, given enough time. In a translation as crystalline and pellucid as the waters of the fjords, Tina Nunnally takes the stories that Asbjørnsen and Moe collected from the people of rural Norway, translates them, and gives them to us afresh. Each story feels honed, as if it were recently collected from a storyteller who knew how to tell it, and who had, in turn, heard it from someone who knew how to tell it. There are a great many sensible people in these stories. Quests are undertaken, disguises adopted, treasures returned with, royalty wed, yes. But there's an ease and a community I love, as well as a way with stories. People seem, many of them, to want to help, and experiencing how information is doled out is a pleasure. Watch the young girl who cannot spin or weave or sew be rescued by 3 old women who can. All they ask is that she call each of them Aunt on her wedding day. I have read dozens of versions of this story, but this is the first to conceal the information about the old women's deformities until the dramatically perfect moment in the story. You will meet youngest sons and foolish farmers, clever women and lost princesses, adventures and fools, just as in any collection of folk stories from anywhere in Northern Europe. But the Norwegian folk tales come with trolls, and if Asbjørnsen and Moe did not see them, as Kittelsen did, then they got their stories from people who had seen the trolls walking in the mist at dawn. Translator's note. There once were 2 Norwegian boys who loved listening to stories, especially folk tales. One was named Petter Christian Asbjørnsen, and the other was Jørgen Moe. At the age of 14, the boys met at school in 1827 and formed a lasting friendship that would prove auspicious for both of them. 10 years later, influenced by the folklore work of the Grimm brothers in Germany, Asbjørnsen and Moe set off separately into the mountainous countryside of southern Norway. They were in search of storytellers who might be willing to share the tales that had been passed down in their families for generations. Over the course of more than 20 years, the 2 young men intermittently continued their work with folk tales, even as they pursued completely different interests. What Asbjørnsen and Moe discovered on these expeditions turned out to be more precious than any hoard of gold and silver, more bountiful than any feast conjured up by a magic tablecloth, and more impressive than a giant 12-headed troll. What they discovered was a cultural treasure trove. The folk tales that Asbjørnsen and Moe wrote down and later collectively published as Norske folkeeventyr, Norwegian folk tales, would nurture Norway's emerging national identity, and the tales would make their names legendary, not just in their own country, but around the world. Petter Christian Asbjørnsen was born in Christiania, present-day Oslo, in 1812. He was the son of a glazier whose family had roots in the Gudbrandsdal region. As a child, Petter often suffered long periods of illness. In his father's workshop, he would listen to local shopkeepers and tradesmen recounting traditional legends and tales. He read widely and had a keen interest in nature, which prompted him to take frequent hikes in the nearby countryside. After he finished school, Asbjørnsen spent 3 years in Romerike as a private tutor before going on to study natural history and medicine. During these years, he laid the groundwork for a literary outpouring that would one day include not only the famous folktale collections, but also Christmas stories, regional legends, scientific treatises. He introduced Darwin's ideas to Norwegian readers in an article published in 1861, and even a seafaring novel. Eventually, Asbjørnsen focused his considerable energy and zeal on zoology, receiving several grants to conduct research along both Oslofjord and Hardangerfjord. There he discovered a new type of starfish, which he named Brissinga indicagnemos, after the necklace called Brisingamen that belonged to the goddess Freya in Nordic mythology. Later, he turned to forestry and studied in Germany, where he met Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm. On returning to Norway, Asbjørnsen was appointed chief forester in Trøndelag. He also became an expert on Norwegian peat production, and both vocations provided him with a steady income for the rest of his life. He died in 1885. Jørgen Moe took an entirely different course in his life. He was born in 1813 in the Norwegian municipality of Hole in the southern region of Ringerike. His father was a prominent landowner and farmer who often represented the area in Stortinget, Norway's parliament. He was determined that his son should study law. But Jørgen had no interest in that field. His passions were literature and the philosophy of aesthetics. Eventually, he would become a respected author and write some of Norway's most beloved poems and songs, including the classic children's story, I brunnen og I skjæret, In the Well and in the Lake. In 1832, recognizing that his literary interests were unlikely to provide him with a living, Moe made the practical decision to study theology. 7 years later, he passed his exams, having weathered a broken engagement and a debilitating period of depression. He wasn't yet ready to become an ordained Lutheran pastor and settle into clergyman duties. Instead, he supported himself by taking various teaching positions as he continued to publish poetry and ballads in the national romantic style. During this period, Moe was corresponding with his longtime friend, Peter Christian Asbjørnsen, about topics such as the retelling of traditional tales by the German author Ludwig Tieck. More significantly, they discussed the groundbreaking work of Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm. The brothers' emphasis on the historical and cultural importance of folklore reignited the enthusiasm the two friends had always felt for Norwegian folk tales. The influence of the Grimm brothers led Moe to write an extensive introduction to the second edition of Norske Folkeeventyr, published in 1852. The first half of Moe's introduction was a lengthy commentary on folktale scholarship in diverse cultures around the world. The second half, now translated into English for the first time and included in this book, presents a fascinating look at Moe's own views of the Norwegian tales, and in particular, how they relate back to the sagas and Norse mythology. Moe wrote, "Like the dwarves Austri, Vestri, Nordri, and Sudri in the Eddas, the winds are personified in the tales about the boy who went to the north wind and demanded the flower back, Soria Moria Castle, and east of the sun and west of the moon. In the story Lillekort, the title character is given a ship that is one and the same with the ship called Skidbladnir of Norse mythology. And you might even deduce that the hunchbacked and one-eyed old woman is reminiscent of the god Odin, whose divine power is manifested in the description of the ship. Asbjørnsen and Moe decided to remove this scholarly introduction from future Norwegian editions in favor of allowing the tales to speak for themselves to readers of all ages. In 1850, Moe lost the research grant that had offered him some measure of financial security, and the following year he married. It was finally time for him to assume his pastoral duties in order to provide for himself and his family. He held positions in Bragernes and Vestre Åker, and in 1876 he was appointed bishop of the Kristiansand diocese. He was known as a masterful preacher, a conservative theologian, and a man who always showed great kindness and devotion to his congregations. Throughout his long career, Moe continued his literary projects, although his clergyman obligations meant that he had to give up further folklore research. In 1872, he became a member of the Royal Norwegian Society of Sciences and Letters. He died in 1882. The publication of Asbjørnsen and Moe's Norske Folkeeventyr began in December 1841 with the appearance of a slim 96-page unbound pamphlet. The pamphlet garnered praise from both Peter Andreas Munch, the influential historian and saga translator, and Johann Sebastian Welhaven, the respected author and literary critic. This positive reception motivated the two young folklorists to continue their expeditions throughout southern Norway, usually going to separate regions in order to collect the most tales for pamphlets. In 1843, a volume of 41 tales was published in Christiania by Johan Dahl, followed in October 1844 by a second volume of 12 tales by the same publisher. Together, these two volumes would make up the first edition of Norske Folkeeventyr. 8 years later, in 1852, a second edition was published that expanded the number of tales to 58, and then finally, in 1866, the third edition included 60 tales, with Asbjørnsen and Moe each adding one new tale. In his foreword to this second edition, Asbjørnsen explained their methodology. The very effort of persuading the nation's storytellers to make themselves known, openly and without reservation, requires approaching them in a unique manner. A direct appeal does not get you far, and even the promise of payment is wasted on the best of them, meaning those who have a love for what has been handed down to them. To convince such people to remove the lock from their lips, it is necessary to possess an innate tact, which is then further developed through practice and by studying the Norwegian people. But above all, it is necessary to allow a true love for these traditions to shine through. You need not bother with any dissembling, for it will have either no effect or the opposite effect in terms of what you wish to achieve. When Asbjørnsen and Moe set off for Norway's deep mountain valleys, they took with them their great love for the traditional tales they had already heard from family, friends, and local storytellers. They were energetic, passionate, and determined young men who wanted to discover and record stories that were part of their cultural heritage. As Moe explained in his introduction to the 1852 edition, although the tales may be similar in content to stories from other nations, they are nevertheless not the same. They are clearly manifestations of our country's unique setting and commonly shared conditions. In this sense, the setting, the entire stage on which a simple and ordinary story is played out, while at the same time a colorful and richly varied imaginary performance takes place, is always the familiar mountainous landscape of Norway. We see the dense forests with the small green clearings where you can rest after a journey, the ridge after ridge of mountains that you must traverse, the heights where Doppelband is raised, the big high mountain that casts a shadow over the king's courtyard, the steep mirror-smooth slope that Aslad has to ride up, the sheltered cleft where the old woman sits and lures in the weary herder. These and thousands of other small details tell us that we are at home in Norway, no matter how amazing the events may be that capture our attention. Just as momentous as their decision to collect the tales was their resolve to not write them down in the distinctive dialects of each region. Instead, they gave the tales a consistent literary voice, while maintaining the vitality and immediacy of oral storytelling. They opted for a syntax and word choices that were clearly Norwegian at a time when the Danish language still weighed heavily on literary and linguistic endeavors in Norway. Asbjørnsen and Moe were initially criticized for dramatically veering away from the established and more formal conventions deemed necessary for written texts. Yet their volumes of folk tales soon sparked a national surge of interest in what was uniquely Norwegian. Asbjørnsen wrote in the foreword to the second edition, "At the time we began our collections, there were undoubtedly few in Norway who regarded the tales as anything more than mere nursery-room chatter, with most viewing our attempt to collect and publish them as childish foolishness. We think that we have contributed in some manner to a recognition of what is meritorious about bringing to light everything that belongs to the nation." Certainly most Norwegians would agree. Generations of Nordic writers, artists, illustrators, and musicians have been influenced by the stories that Asbjørnsen and Moe collected and published in the mid-1800s. Generations of children have grown up shivering with awe and anticipation as they read tales about magic spells, mountain-sized trolls, resourceful princesses, and the intrepid young boy named Aslad. Nearly 180 years after the publication of the first slim volume, Norske Folkeeventyr is still considered a national treasure. Countless editions have been published in Norway and the rest of Scandinavia, and the names Asbjørnsen and Moe have become synonymous with this sparkling example of Norway's proud cultural traditions. It didn't take long for the work of Asbjørnsen and Moe to make its way to other parts of the world, thanks to early translations. The first English translation was published in 1859 under the title Popular Tales from the Norse. It was based on the 58 tales presented in the second edition of Norske Folkeeventyr and included a lengthy introduction by the translator, Sir George Webb Dasent, 1817–96. Dasent had developed an interest in Nordic tales and mythology after meeting Jakob Grimm in Stockholm. He went on to publish many translations from the Scandinavian languages and was especially known for his English renderings of Icelandic sagas. What is most remarkable about this first translation is that it has remained the only English translation to include the initial collection of all 58 folk tales. When Asbjørnsen and Moe added 2 tales to their third edition, a total of 60 stories then became the standard number in later Norwegian volumes. Subsequent English translations have presented only a handful of stories. Even the publication of Norwegian Folktales in 1960, translated by Pat Shaw and Carl Norman, contains only 35 tales, and less than a third of these are from the original Norske Folkeeventyr. Several years ago, Eric Anderson, editor at the University of Minnesota Press, mentioned to me that he had long wanted to publish a new translation of the folktales collected by Asbjørnsen and Moe. I have always loved translating classic literature, so I was intrigued by the idea, but I was busy with other books and the timing wasn't right. In 2017, generous funding opportunities from Norway and an opening in my work schedule suddenly made the folktale project feasible. Before I agreed to take on what would be a very challenging endeavor, I decided to look at several stories translated by Dasent. His popular Tales from the Norse has been reprinted many times, even quite recently, and I wanted to be sure that there was a need for a new English translation. I quickly concluded that although Dasent's translation may have been suitable for a 19th century audience, it would not appeal to modern-day readers. The style is uneven and inconsistent, there are misunderstandings, and the wording seems clumsy and old-fashioned. Certain details are more identifiable as British rather than Norwegian. Dasent chooses bannock instead of lefse, boots instead of Aslad, and, strangely enough, he describes Norway's majestic mountains as hills. Of greatest concern is the loss of the storytelling voice that Asbjørnsen and Moe were so careful to instill in the Norwegian. Accuracy is essential in any translation, but just as important is capturing the voice or tone of a literary work. The translator must try to convey in her own language the rhythm and cadence, what I call the music of the original. This is one of the most difficult tasks a translator must accomplish. Asbjørnsen and Moe adopted a clear and deceptively simple narrative style that was meant to be read aloud. They used repetition and alliteration to mimic the tradition of oral storytelling. The tales are filled with humor, rhymes, and an abundance of detail. Sometimes they choose words specific to the old farming way of life in Norway, using terms no longer common today. Payments are made in daler and skillinger, reflecting the monetary system of the time. And there's a lot of dialogue, which has to sound natural, not too archaic and not too modern. Throughout the stories, the towering mountains and dense forests of the Norwegian landscape are always vividly present. I would need to consider all these stylistic issues, but clearly it was time for a new English translation of Asbjørnsen and Moe's Norwegian Folktales. I happily delved into the project. I wanted to go back to the original source, so I chose to work from the 4th Norwegian edition. This turned out to be doubly daunting because the book was printed in the Old Gothic script with almost no paragraph markings. With each of the previous editions, Asbjørnsen and Moe had made changes to the Norwegian language in terms of syntax, spelling, and word choice. The 4th edition was the last time the two friends decided together which revisions should be made to the text. Subsequent revisions, occasionally even in the storyline, were largely made by Moe's son, Moltke. Later Norwegian editions continued the process begun by Asbjørnsen and Moe of making the language more Norwegian. I grew up in a Finnish-American family, and from an early age I was familiar with the trolls and the elves, Tantor, that inhabit the forests of Finland. I was also familiar with the more benign Danish elves, called Nisse. My siblings and I used to scare ourselves silly by looking at John Bauer's illustrations in our mother's book of Swedish fairy tales. As a child I read Tove Jansson's Moomin books, Alice in Wonderland, the fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen, and many other books filled with magic and enchantment. I read a tame version of the Three Billy Goats Gruff and a few other Norwegian stories. And of course I'd seen pictures and carvings of Norwegian trolls. But I had never actually read Asbjørnsen and Moe's Norske Folkeeventyr. What a joyous discovery! All those gigantic trolls are both ferocious and strangely endearing. They lumber through the dark forests and hunker down inside the mountains. Some of the trolls bellow and roar, while some of them wheedle and whine. They matter-of-factly lop off heads, turn princes into stone, and whisk folks away into the mountains. Yet none is a match for the bold and inventive Aslad, who has no compunction about chopping off troll heads, even 12 at a time. As Moe explained in his introduction to the 2nd edition, everywhere we can see, as in the sagas, the direct and ruthless way in which everything is described, a means of expression that stems not from cruelty but from naivete and lack of guile. We find the same bold and magnificent sense of humor that, like the hero in a German tale, seems to be presented in order to teach fear. We discover everywhere the pure epic narrative style whose sole purpose is the joy of observation. Hence it dwells as much on the sorrowful and terrible as it does on the bright and cheerful, but it rarely, if ever, reveals the disposition of the narrator as events unfold. There are observant princesses who know the secrets to wielding a magic sword, and servant girls who use their wits to marry a prince. A sister persists in an impossible task to rescue her brothers. A brave maiden rides the north wind to save the prince who had been turned into a polar bear. There are talking horses, clever foxes, and steadfast roosters. I was astonished by the lively humor and the sheer variety of the stories. Some show the virtues of kindness, the husband's daughter and the wife's daughter, or integrity, the honest 4-shilling coin. Some explain aspects of the natural world, why the bear has a stump of a tail, and some are just plain odd, the rooster and the hen. Translating these 60 tales into English has been an honor and a delight. I hope that many more generations of readers, both young and old, will now enjoy the treasure trove that Norwegian storytellers long ago entrusted to Petter Christian Asbjørnsen and Jørgen Moe, those two young men who loved folk tales. Tina Nunnally, April 2019, Albuquerque, New Mexico. About Aslad, who stole the troll's silver ducks, coverlet, and golden harp. There once was a poor man who had 3 sons. When he died, the two older sons were about to set off into the world to try their luck, but they refused to take the youngest with them.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?